Welcome back. High above the vines here in Bridgepaw, on the Bridgepaw Triangle. Boy, we got a good podcast for you today with Mark Krasnow. He's just talking about some really interesting stuff. But first, a couple plugs. DecibelWines.com, last chance to get in if you're in the U.S. Into the U.S. Wine Club. We can extend it if you sign up. We're going to send the wine out next week. So today is Tuesday, the 17th of October. Got a few days. If you want to sneak in, we can work something out with you, but that's a really good deal. And then, of course, the New Zealand Wine Club. That's always going every 3 months. We're sending out wine to you folks. So please check that out. And that's at decibelwines.com, right on the homepage, easy to find. Now, besides that, we've got a great event coming up November 16th at Bare Knuckle Barbecue. I'm going to release a new wine that I'm going to call Junta, after my great-grandparents, their family, the Juntas, who were, simple, straight talking, hard-working Sicilian folks. And this is pretty much a simple, straightforward summer wine that is a Malbec Nouveau. So light, fruity, unoaked. Yeah, it should be a fun little wine. It's definitely going to be priced right. And what better place to release a wine like that than at Bare Knuckle Barbecue here in Hastings. So Jimmy and now the new chef Jonathan, we are going to put together some special dishes for that and just have a party, just hang outside. We'll have the wines for sale. Obviously you can buy wines by the glass there, and then we're going to have a really good deal for people to do case buys that day. We'll have all the rest of the Decibel wines up there too. But yeah, this Junta thing's kind of a new project for me. And I just came across the name. I've always wanted to name a wine Junta, but then I only recently looked up the literal meaning, and it means a nice addition, a nice addition to the family. So, or sometimes they would give it to a new son in the Middle Ages in Sicily. So, seemed like perfect name for it, again, considering that family. My grandmother was a pretty straight up, straight talking, simple woman. Well, what woman is simple? Ooh, should I say that in this controversial day? But what else? Hawke's Bay Wine Awards are tonight. We're going to go with the whole Decibel team. A couple of the growers. The Viognier got a gold medal, so we'll see. Maybe we might get more. We'll see. We'll go tonight. Should be a fun night. Always good to get together with the industry and have a few drinks and a few laughs. There's a lot of characters in Hawke's Bay, and it's good to get them all under one tent. I would say one room, but we'll be under a big marquee at the Hawke's Bay Showgrounds. So that should be really fun. And if anybody's out there and that event comes up next year, I do suggest going to it. It's really fun. It's not a cheap ticket, but it's a formal event, and that's the one formal event of the year we have for Hawke's Bay wine growers. And yeah, it's a lot of fun. So I hope to see some of my mates tonight. Should be a good time. Now, on to Kras. Mark Krasnow we're going to talk to today. He is not just a fellow American, but he is somebody who I've known for a while. He started teaching at EIT when I was in my third year there of my wine chemistry degree. He came in on the viticulture side, and unfortunately I never had him as a lecturer, but I became pretty good buddies with him, hanging out here and there. He moved back to New York to go teach at CIA. He's been a lecturer at UCal Davis, which is obviously one of the more prestigious wine and viticulture schools in the world. And thankfully he's come back to Hawke's Bay and Marlborough. He kind of bounces between both, and he loves New Zealand to do that. And he saw an opportunity, and he saw a need for him. For his ideals in water. So we're going to talk a lot about water today, which is a real hot topic, I think all over New Zealand, but particularly in Hawke's Bay. And I think his research in the coming years, I sort of go into it during the podcast, that his research is just so big for what's happening right now with the WCO in Hawke's Bay, and we had some water issues last year, and I think water's just on everybody's mind right now in Hawke's Bay. And he's a guy in our industry who can make some serious waves, no pun intended, in the industry with his pressure bomb and research and data that he's doing. And he basically goes into all that. I don't want to try to explain it without him doing it. So the only thing I want to do is plug his beer too. He has a little brewery project called Crazy Bay Beers, and they're good beers, man. I've had them a lot. I like the Cherokee quite a bit. As he and I can't remember if we discussed this on or off air, but I like maltier beers. I don't like so just over the top with the hops. I like beers that are balanced, and that's the kind of beers they're making. So yeah, let's listen to Kras and talk to him and enjoy it, guys. You're going to learn a lot in this one. Welcome back, Mark. One of my two-time podcasters. You were here. You were like number 2 or 3 on the list.
And I'm back for a victory lap now.
And I will say I've changed my format because I distinctly remember reading like an ad or something during your thing, and you were like, "I just feel gross, Dan." So I now
feel that way a lot of the time.
Yeah, I
do. In my own defense,
I do that before and after now. So my special guests don't have to be a part of my, reading about, all my advertisers I have, Mark.
Yes, that's right. Well, someone's got to pay the bills.
Soap from the laundry mat and all this kind of, refrigeration cleaners, all the stuff for the housewives that listen to the Vintage Stories podcast,
Well, when you've got a voice as silky smooth as yours, Dan.
So what's going on, man? You're back and forth. Where are you living now?
Yeah, I live down in Marlborough now, but have lots of research activity and consulting activity up here in Hawke's Bay. So make reasonably frequent trips up here during the off season.
Because now direct flights to Blenheim, or
there are. I drove though. I needed my ute this time.
Uh-huh.
So that's the thing. So I only have one vehicle, even though there's 2 regions. So.
But during the summer.
That'd be a fly up.
Yeah, because that ferry in the summer, the price just ticks up,
Yes.
And availability, I'm sure, and all that.
Yeah.
And any other regions you go to, or just the 2 biggies?
Well, we've got a little bit of research activity in Central, so I'll go down there a couple times a year and maybe do some readings for some people down there. But it's not a place, if it's our consulting sort of requires lots of regular visits because we're actually measuring vines, a bit different than a wine consultant. So we need to go frequently to those vineyards. So anything outside of where we're based is difficult.
And I know you have somebody working for you up here anywhere.
Yeah, I got a couple people up here and a couple people down there.
Cool.
Yeah.
So, on a torrential downpour day in Hawke's Bay, let's talk about water.
Yeah, I was driving in thinking how ironic it was that we were going to talk about water and water scarcity when it's just pouring down.
I don't exactly have an insulated office studio here, so we're lucky it stopped for a little while. But I was thinking, oh man, they're going to get a nice hum in the back of the podcast because it was just coming down for a while there this morning. But anyway, you are, you're doing it, man. What's going on? You're doing pressure bombs.
Yes. So, we use a piece of scientific equipment to sort of measure how hard vines are having to work for water. So getting an idea of sort of how stressed or not that they are, with the idea being that it doesn't make a lot of sense to water a vine that doesn't need it. You just create excessive vigor and you reduce the quality of fruit, and you maybe have to thin fruit off that you wouldn't have had to thin otherwise. So, it's easy to do. Certainly to turn on the taps and just leave them going all season. But what you don't see are the sort of hidden costs and the hidden loss in quality there. So we're trying to sort of help people read their vines so that they're being more efficient with their resources.
So after because I was at what was that, Red Symposium, is that what it was called?
The NZ SVO workshop. Yeah.
So that was pretty eye-opening, and I mean, I wasn't necessarily surprised by it, but I was certainly happy that you had some great results, at least some data that was significant, as we always talk about in statistics.
Well, okay, so let me just throw the caveat. Let me put on my scientist hat and
Good.
put in the caveat here. Those that we only ever made one wine from the dry side of that trial and one wine from the wet side, so we can't do stats. So there's no degrees of freedom there.
That's true. How many vintages? 5 you'd have to do probably?
Of a single wine, I'm not. I think you could do it if you did that. And in fact, that project actually sort of is now this season being rolled out across the country. So we just got funding from the New Zealand wine growers to do an irrigation project. Half of it's in whites, where the idea is to get the same yield we're getting now, same quality we're getting now, but use less water. The other half of the trial, which is more what we did, and the wines that we showed at the NZSVO, is looking at using water as a means to control the vines, to control their yield, and to increase the quality by actually purposely stressing vines, mild stress, not leaves falling off sort of stress.
Yeah.
For controlled amounts of time at controlled stages in the berry's development.
And let's rewind a second, because let's talk about 2 things. One is historically what it's been like in New Zealand, as far as, and with all good fine reason. I think one of the great things about New Zealand wine is the learning curve is really good, and we might make mistakes, but we're quick to adjust because we probably don't have a lot of laws and culture to hold us up from doing so. And then the other thing I want to talk about is your history, or where you come from, and maybe some of the California winemaking where you actually have to pay for water. Mm-hmm. And so it's not really a choice in the matter. And then the other thing I'm going to do is stand up and shut our door so that the cat doesn't come in and start meowing in the middle.
Okay, that's fair enough. So as far as sort of traditional irrigation in New Zealand, we're sort of blessed here in that we have a climate where rain comes periodically during the summer. Where I studied in California, that's not the case. You can be pretty well guaranteed that throughout the summer you'll maybe get one rainstorm, maybe.
This is
nothing else.
Napa, Sonoma?
Napa, Sonoma, Northern California. I was in Davis, but the weather patterns are, pretty bloody consistent there.
There's quite a bit of vineyards up near Sacramento and stuff as well.
There are, yeah. They don't get the sort of repute or the renown of Napa and Sonoma, and they don't demand the same price. But there are some great wines being made there because it's proper varieties, hot weather, southern Italian varieties, which do well in a hot, dry climate, as opposed to trying to shoehorn in Chardonnay into a really, really warm climate where it's never evolved to deal with that, and it's never going to fully express its potential in those sort of climates. So New Zealand does have this sort of weather that would allow for dry farms, for sort of viticulture similar to what they do in the high-end areas of France, where no irrigation is allowed, because we get those rains, and the vines are not sitting for months at a time with no water, which vines can cope with, but it requires some training of the vine and dramatic reductions in yield. So
what about baby vines? First 3 years, everybody always says, you got to irrigate in those first 3 years, and and then other people say, well, I'll get on to sort of organic and weed spraying and all that as another thing, but let's just start with water in those first 3 years. What do you think about that? It's just
well, even in areas of France and areas of Europe that dry farm, they do allow you to irrigate your vines before they start yielding fruit, and it is something you need to do if you're going to get a very dry season. Simply because these young vines have a tiny root system, and so they're exploring only a tiny little patch of soil, which they can suck dry pretty quickly. And if they can't grow new roots into new soil fast enough for the water that they use up, then those vines can go into stress and lose their leaves, and then they're still alive, but they're not doing anything that's going to serve them. They're not making any energy to grow new roots because they're basically just sort of holding their breath and trying to stay alive. That said, irrigating frequently and often when you're establishing young vines really stunts their root growth.
Because they don't have a reason to grow. Why
would they spend energy growing roots, which is the organ to get water and minerals, when they already have plenty of those things? Yep. So, and that, fortunately or unfortunately, has been the way that vines tend to be established in the New World, New Zealand included. And so what we have here are some mature vineyards, maybe 15, 20-year-old vineyards that have the root system that a 3 or 4-year-old dry farm vineyard would have. That it's very shallow. They're not exploring the soil to any depth because they've never needed to.
Have you had any experience in recovery, or I don't know if that's the right word, but basically, a vineyard that has, been traditionally, or for New World traditionally, and they have, their 15-year-old vine that has 3-4-year-old root system, and then you start stressing them, and then how quickly can they recover?
Well, I mean, that's really what we're doing with our consulting clients, is that we are measuring the vines and we're bringing them to regulated levels of stress that basically send a signal to the vine, geez, I'm running out of water, so I definitely need to stop growing new leaves and new shoots because those are the source of my water loss, and I need to focus more of my energy on growing roots.
Yep.
So, for this trial that we did with Villa Maria over here in the gravels, the berries ended up being 30% lighter than the berries on the well-watered side. All of that energy that would have gone into cell division in those berries and cell expansion in those berries went into root growth. And so over time, anytime that you sort of limit the above-ground growth that a vine's doing, if you don't water a vine, you see the slow, sluggish shoot growth and you think, oh, geez, that vine's not growing. What you don't see is that the vine's totally growing. It's just growing underground, that it's spending more of its energy on developing a root system rather than growing leaves and shoots and fruit. And so really for all of our consulting clients, especially those growing red grapes where we tend to stress them a little bit more, those vines are every year becoming a little bit more resilient, and every year their root systems are growing and exploring new soil, and it actually makes it easier then to sort of deficit irrigate those grapes in the future. And the idea for most of our clients is that ideally they'd like to dry farm their vines at some point.
Sure.
And never have to worry about irrigation.
Hey, that'd be great. I think you could do it here. We should, I don't know, maybe Otago is about the driest, would you say? Or
Otago is definitely the driest, but they have the benefit of growing Pinot Noir where you're not looking to get a ton of yield. Marlborough has some really dry, gravelly soils. And at the same time, they're growing Sauvignon Blanc and wanting 16 tons a hectare. And so that really requires, I hate the term hydroponic viticulture, but you really do need to irrigate a hell of a lot of water onto those vines, and often a lot of minerals too, because those soils that don't have a lot of clay and don't have a lot of silt, they don't have the ability to hold on to minerals. And so those vines can easily scavenge all the minerals in the soil that there's exploring and end up deficient as they continue to grow. And so you need to then fertigate those vines or put on solid fertilizer.
Sounds like some Gimlet Gravels vineyards I've worked on.
Well, Gimlet Gravels is definitely another extreme, but again, on the Gravels, it's mostly reds.
Yeah.
So you don't need this
The
wall of leaves as your canopy, and you're not trying to get a huge amount of fruit.
So then Villa, from what I could tell, was pretty pleased with the results of, more open bunches, smaller berries, more intense fruit for their premium wines, their premium reds coming off of the Gravels. So I guess within reason, I don't know.
Obviously they don't want to drop their yield to the point where it's not economically sustainable.
Sure.
But what we got off that vineyard was 10 ton naturally, just through smaller berries. And that is exactly the yield they would normally have hand thinned to
10
get.
10 ton a hectare.
10 ton per hectare.
Yeah.
So it ended up coming bang on yield, but they didn't have to spend the single most expensive pass through the vineyard, which is sending people through to drop fruit, because that's not something that's easily mechanizable.
No.
And so they were really pleased. And when we tasted these wines at this workshop, it was a room full of 60 winemakers, and I think 58 of them preferred the dry wine to the wine that was traditionally irrigated. So, while there wasn't stats on the wines themselves, I would say that finding and the fact that pretty much everyone in the room preferred them is a statistically valid result.
Just put it this way, they were close enough, and even, obviously there was a sway for the more intense fruit, but the money and the stats alone are, and I'm not just talking like pH, TA, and all that, which seem to be more favorable to the dry farm stuff or the stressed block. But just the idea that like it was a better result, but pretty much it could be pretty similar without all that stupid effort into, which is pretty typical of a Kiwi vineyard and probably other New World, to mow, trimming, weed eaters or weed sprays, like, all this extra passing and working of tractor time and people time and, all this extra stuff and sprays because, you have these bunches that are, these berries that are so big and fat and squashing each other that, there's so all that, aside from the fact that actually we preferred the wine, which was like a bonus.
Yeah.
It's like, I think we're good enough winemakers to, if the fruit's pretty similar and clean, like you're going to make a good wine out of it,
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and these are sort of the hidden costs that I say are associated with maybe giving the vines more water than they need, which haven't really been considered. And so as part of this trial, what we're doing is splitting vineyards in half and irrigating half traditionally and irrigating the other half based on the pressure chamber readings. But another part of the trial is we're going to keep track of the economics of all of this. We're going to keep track of that. Both halves of the vineyards will be managed separately. So we'll keep track of the number of passes for weed spraying, for trimming, for leaf plucking, for things like that, and for crop thinning, so that we can, and then look at yield at the end and, go with how much they're getting per ton. So we can actually look at the economics of growing grapes. And I think, obviously I have no data because we haven't done any experiments yet, but based on our little trial that we did with Villa, that it will not only be better quality fruit and better wines from the stress side, but it'll also be significantly less to farm those grapes.
Yeah.
So a win on sort of the quality point of view, but also a win on the economic point of view.
And have you seen, for example, we're in the Bridge Pa district now. I know you've worked on some Bridge Pa vineyards. Last year being a bit of a strange year because we had such a drought all summer, and then we had 2 cyclones come through and another 100 mil rain incident in February, I think it was.
Yeah.
It was a bit of a strange year, but just from what you saw, because I know you kind of expanded into some other regions, what did you see between or have you seen anything significant during the year between those 2 regions, for example? Or
Yeah, well, I mean, in Marlborough, we didn't get the same season at all. So we got the same tons of rain around harvest, which was less than ideal. But what we didn't have, which Hawke's Bay did, which I think is really the savior for the Hawke's Bay wines in 2017, was that they had an outrageously hot and dry early summer up till mid-February. I think February 15th was the first of the big rains, and they didn't really let up till after that. And so, the thing that opened my eyes really was, we had sort of had in mind a level of stress, about 12 bars, which, doesn't mean anything to who's never used a pressure bomb. But let's just say it's sort of mild to moderate stress. We saw...
We could explain.
We could explain, and I will explain the pressure bomb in a sec.
Okay.
But what we saw last season was vines getting to 16 bars, 17 bars, like much drier than we had, targeted, simply because it was not only hot, it was really windy. But the amazing thing was that those vines had no outward signs of any sort of stress at all.
From what I saw in the vineyard, that you couldn't tell one from the other, except for maybe they trimmed it less, but they probably just trimmed the other one, so it's tough to tell.
Yeah.
But it was. There wasn't anything stressful going on, and such a drought year too. It was pretty eye-opening.
Yeah, so it was sort of a worst-case scenario from a trying to keep up with irrigation point of view, but the fact that the vines came through it looking fine. The fruit was a bit of a different story because, wet bunches that stay wet for months at a time are always going to rot and split. But the fact that those vines could get that stressed and sit in stress for a couple days at a time with no leaf loss, no ill effects was really heartening. Showing that these vines are a lot tougher. I had worried that these sort of hydroponically grown vines were going to have such a small root system that a couple of days of 35-degree weather plus wind was going to bring them to the point that they wouldn't be able to recover, and that was definitely not the case. So It gives me a little bit more. Faith that we can really push these vines and we can really bring them into bordering on severe stress without losing leaves, but which definitely sends a signal internally to the fruit and internally to the vine to put the kibosh on shoot growth and to really focus on making that fruit as flavorful and palatable as possible.
It seems like, I don't know, everything that I've seen to an extent with a vine, there's always a stress reaction to what you do. And I'm not a doctor of viticulture. And I don't even have a degree in viticulture, though I did start as a vit guy before you got there.
I won't judge, Dan. Don't worry.
But the department was in shambles until you showed up, Mark, and I had already made my decision to switch to winemaking. Had nothing to do with the fact that I love being in a cellar, but and I got tired of leaf plucking really quick.
Yeah, it turns out machines can do a pretty good job of that. They don't complain as much.
But anyway, you do something within reason to a vine. It reacts to that stress usually in a pretty positive way. Again, within reason.
Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting to see it's a weed.
It is.
It wants to survive,
It definitely does, and and it wants to spread its seed. And I mean, the way to grow any crop, if you're trying to focus on the fruit, is that you need to convince that plant to focus on the next generation and not on itself. And when you give a vine plenty of water, the signal that that vine gets is, "Geez, I'm in a great place." So yeah, I'll grow some fruit and I'll make some babies, but what I'm really going to do is make myself as big as possible and grow more shoots so that in the future I'll be able to make even more babies.
Yeah.
And that's sort of how we've grown the grapes and ended up having too much yield and too much leaf and having to pluck leaves and drop crop. Whereas if you convince the vine that, geez, it's maybe not the best place to live, maybe it's drying out frequently and the vine's thinking, all right, I want to have babies, but I want them to go someplace better than where I am. Well, then they need to make those grapes as flavorful and beautiful as possible for something like a bird to come by and take the fruit and drop it somewhere else.
Yeah, they haven't stressed themselves out enough to swat birds away themselves, though.
No, not yet. Not yet. It would save everybody a lot of money if we could evolve that. Problem is, what would they do to viticulturists in the vineyard?
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, let's go back to the pressure bomb.
Yeah.
And how that all works and what you do when you're, when do you start, first of all, doing it in a given season?
Well, I mean, the way we're going to do it is we're going to start for all of our clients and for the research project weeks before any water would actually be needed, because most people around here, depending on the soils you're in the gravels, people might start, well, in a typical season where it hasn't been raining all the time, might start thinking about watering in a couple of weeks, once there's sort of, 30 centimeters of growth.
So end of October, maybe?
Yeah. I mean, most of the people who I have worked with, and truth be told, most of the clients that we have are in the Triangle.
Yeah.
Which does hold a hell of a lot more water than the gravels. Most of them don't really start thinking about irrigation till around Christmas time.
Do you think that it's just a matter of the fact of the wineries that you're working with, or that people in the gravels are a little scared of what you're doing or something, or that they're just not quite ready yet?
Well, I mean, the gravels, because you've got a couple of things working against you in the gravels. You've got severe variations in the vineyards. So just as you go down a row, you can have vines that were planted on the exact same day, and some of them have, tree trunks.
Yeah.
And others have like a pencil as their trunk, simply because the soil that pencil vine is on is mostly stones with very little dirt and very little mineral and very little ability to hold water. And then in these hollows where you have your trees, you've got a huge amount of silt. So those vines, even though they're in the same vineyard, even though they might be 3 meters from each other, are going to produce dramatically different amounts and qualities of fruit. So it's a difficult place to farm for that. And secondly, you see those little vines and you see them suffer. And if, let's say, you blow a main or a riser blows off of your irrigation, so let's say a half a row or a row goes without water for, well, you don't know how long. And all of a sudden you go out there and you see that all of your sad little vines have lost all their leaves or they've turned yellow. And you have no idea how long those vines have been without water. But the signal it sends to you as a grower is, geez, I need to keep these vines watered or they're all just going to kick their heels up.
Yeah.
And it is true, vines will do that, but only after they've been in stress for a really long period of time. And so what I think people haven't realized is how long those vines have been without water before they start to look real sick. And so people in the gravels, because they have these very variable vineyards, and because they kind of have to irrigate to their driest part of their vineyard so that those vines survive, you end up irrigating every couple of days.
Yeah.
And generally, because the idea is these soils don't hold any water, you don't want to put on 12 hours of water, because most of that, presumably, is just running right through the soil back down into the aquifer. And so you'd be wasting your energy.
We'll get back to that.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think anyone knows how much water these soils hold, and I personally think they hold much more than the average grower does. But the perception is that the soils don't hold water, so I can't irrigate longer than an hour or two. But my vines can't go more than 2 days without water. So you get into the cycle of irrigating vines every other day or even every day for short periods. And that's the perfect recipe to grow weeds. I'm not so sure it's the perfect way to grow grapes.
Yeah. Man, we'll get back to the aquifer thing as well. But anyway, getting back to your pressure bomb. So you go in and what do you do?
Yep. So very simple piece of equipment, has been around in scientific circles for over 60 years. Okay, so it's nothing new. It's nothing high tech. It's basically a sealable chamber that you can put a leaf into, which you can pressurize with a compressed gas cylinder, and we use nitrogen and a pressure gauge. So the way I like to explain it is leaves are sucking on water. They're pulling on water. Okay, and they're pulling a little bit harder than the trunk, and the trunk's pulling a little bit harder than the roots, and the roots are pulling a little bit harder from the soil. Right? And that's what keeps water flowing from the soil through the roots, through the trunk, out the leaves, to keep the vine doing what it's doing. So what you can do is if you pull one of those leaves off, you cover it so that it doesn't lose any water once you pluck it from the vine. You put a little bag over the leaf and you put it into the chamber and you pressurize that chamber. You seal the leaf in and you pressurize that chamber with its stem sticking out of the chamber. And when the pressure that you've applied is equal to the suction that leaf was pulling with, what you see is that water just rises to the surface of the leaf stem or the petiole. And so you know instantaneously at that point when you pluck that leaf off the vine, that was how hard the leaf was working.
Yeah.
And certain processes happen at certain water potentials. And so that number is called water potential. And you can measure it in bars, which is the sort of imperial measure, or you can measure it in megapascals, which is the metric measure. But in either case, certain physiological processes happen at certain water potentials. Like shoot elongation is one of the first things to slow down as a vine dries down. So that starts to happen around 7 or 8, 9 bars, something like that. As the vine gets drier and drier, the stomata on the leaves will actually close. So the vine will, so I guess I should take a step back. So stomata are these pores on the leaves. So vines basically from the air drink in CO2 and they absorb light in the leaves. Okay, and that light and the CO2 are used in the process of photosynthesis to make sugars, which is the currency of all plants. The problem, the inevitable consequence of having these pores open to bring in CO2 is that the vine will always lose water. Okay, and so at a certain point when a vine gets dry, it's better to stop making sugar, but conserve your water and stay alive, than to continue to do photosynthesis. And so when I say we're targeting these vines, especially red wine, we're targeting stress. We're purposely putting the vines into stress. I'm talking about a level where they start to close these stomata. So they're actually being less efficient than they could be, but that's exactly what we want as growers. We don't want them to be going full bore all the time because that means huge berries. It means lots of shoot growth. And as a red wine grower, you want as small a berries as you can get, obviously as long as you get your yield, and you want an open canopy that allows light exposure on the fruit. And so we use the numbers generated by the pressure chamber to basically make the decision whether those vines need water or not.
Cool.
Yeah, and it's very replicatable, and it's the tool to sort of measure any plants, not just grapevines, in a research setting.
Yeah. So, like you said, not exactly revolutionized technology, but just something that nobody else has been doing
in New Zealand.
In New Zealand, that's what I mean.
In California, in Australia, in Europe, where, either you're not allowed to, in Europe it's more of a research tool, but in California where you pay for every gallon of water that you use, you sure as hell don't want to waste any. And so a pressure chamber is a pretty standard tool for a viticulturist there to assess whether that precious water needs to be put on the grapes or not.
Which brings me to a very hot topic.
Yeah,
in
it is a
Hawke's Bay
very
right now.
hot topic. Yeah.
So without getting politicizing ourselves or aligning ourselves with who or what or whatever, I've actually reached out to some of the people involved with at least Hawke's Bay wine growers and the ongoing conversation about the water conservation order and tank and all this. I would love for one of them to come and sit down in a long format and just discuss what's going on. But I do think from the meetings that I've been to that it's a little bit of a sensitive issue for the wine growers because on the one hand, we do want to preserve the river and we do want to preserve. So we've kind of taken this compromise. And we also don't want to be seen to the spying public that we're not for the environment, which I'm pretty sure everybody is. But so we've kind of gone with this compromise where we say, the upper Nararoa River, we are very happy to conserve all that. It's a very special, pristine native bush, and that's great. Whereas the lower, which is all these braided parts of the river that are, I guess the trout fishermen and fishing game are they've kind of gone the legal route to which has been very successful for them throughout. They have no community dialogue, nothing like that. They've gone strictly to the courts, and it's been. I'm going to just say from what I've read and what I've heard that I think it's pretty unfair that it just goes across the board. They don't want a real dialogue; they just want to shut it down.
Yeah.
Now they could be 100% right. I have no idea. And we don't know really what's going on underground with the aquifers and everything exactly. We don't know what's being drawn off of there.
Yep. No, that's all very true. There's a bit of guesswork involved in all of these, and I'm not really familiar with sort of how Fish and Game has gotten the numbers that they have.
It just seems strange to me. Again, I'm like a kind of as always in Hawke's Bay. In an interesting position because I can be like an outsider, but even on this one, I'm not a grower, so I don't have I just want good fruit, and I want I want the industry to thrive and everything. But I can also see the point of exactly what we're talking about. It's like, well, everybody's over irrigating. First of all, I think the wine industry, even though we irrigate too much, we're pennies on the dollar to what some of these farms are doing around here, where I get so pissed off. I'm driving down the road and there's sprinklers literally while it's raining, they're on and they're spraying onto the road, and I'm like, who has these people in check? Like, come on, have a little bit of and it's like there's no, while we're doing like drip irrigation across a vineyard, and it's again, pennies on the dollar, for lack of a better analogy. So it's a complex issue, and we'll see how it all shakes out. I'm not going to put you on the spot because I don't know how much you know about it, but I would say you could be a man in demand
yes.
very quickly in the coming years.
Certainly, to be honest, in this election, and I'm not talking about the water conservation order, I'm talking about the nationwide election, which just took place in September here. The Labor Party brought up the idea of a water tax. Now, Labor didn't win a majority of the votes, and it still remains to be seen whether they'll form a coalition that will rule. But I think the fact that people are thinking about water, that it's something that's on people's minds, is a good thing. It's a good thing for the quality. I mean, at least on the viticulture side, it's a good thing for the quality of the grapes. For something like apples, tonnage is what determines your margin, and tonnage comes from water. It's only in grapes that this idea of purposely reducing yield to increase the quality of the remaining fruit is really a thing in agriculture. There's no other agricultural crop where that is true. It has been proven again and again in grapes that it is the case. Yeah. An overcrop vine doesn't make as good a quality of wine for most styles, and definitely for all red wines, than a vine that's producing fewer grapes.
Yeah. So we're in a good position.
We are
in that sense, and that we, if forced to, we can pivot and correct ourselves from the sins of the past.
Yeah, I see what you did there with pivot. That's clever. So, and as you said, viticulture is a really minor offender when it comes to the amount of water put on. And when studies have been done, sort of whether viticulture is a net user of water or provider of water. Again and again, every time they crunch the numbers, viticulture is a net provider of water. Because vines are dormant during the winter, all of the water that falls on a vineyard in the winter goes right back to the aquifer. Yeah. So yes, we do irrigate in the summer, and yes, our vines do use water to transpire and ripen their fruit. But overall, vineyards give back more water than they take, and not all farming in New Zealand does that.
Certainly not. Certainly not when they're sprinklering the highway as you're driving through your car and you get watered.
Yep.
No, it's going to be interesting, and I wish, or I hope, I don't know. I think I always say this about New Zealand is we have a chance to do things right here, and I see the sort of capitalist attitude of hey, we won't try to make some money out of this too. But it seems like if the dialogue is correct, that we can get that point across, and we can, use someone like yourself to achieve what we need to achieve. And then as an industry as a whole, like we could, support somebody like the Giblet Gravels, who's probably going to need a little more water than your typical vineyard.
Yeah.
And say, even with what they do, here's the research, and hopefully New Zealand wine growers and Hawke's Bay wine growers and the Bridge Pa and everybody, we all kind of all get on the same team. But from what I've seen so far, it's been a little bit of a dance to like, well, we kind of want to say this, but I'm telling you, I came out of the first meeting and I was like, I wanted to raise my hand and be like, well, what is our position like? But I'm not a grower, so I don't want to be that guy. And but I kind of wanted to say like, and I don't think anybody really knew. I think they knew that this was being forced on them really quick without a real dialogue.
Yeah.
And that they didn't want to piss off their markets, that they wanted that sustainability card and they want to be friendly to the river and everything. But then, you kind of see, what is it, No Way or what is the signs you see now? I don't know if you've seen them around Hawke's Bay, but there's one just up the road now here, and it's like say no to WCO.
Yeah, I drove by one on the way here as well.
Yeah. Which we haven't aligned. New Zealand wine growers or Hawke's Bay wine growers hasn't aligned themselves with that, black and white message, which they are black and white signs.
They are literally, yes. And they do have pictures of cows on them, at least the one I saw, and I think it's probably that industry that's a little bit more anti any thought of reducing water.
I could go on and on about
we don't need to slag off other primary industries. So yeah, I'm not really sure. I'm going to a meeting this evening with some people involved in this argument and some of the lawyers and things like that. I know that a worst case scenario sort of was laid out to me, where if the low flow in the river is redefined to what the fish and game people want it to be, it could mean that there could be a period as long as, I want to say it was 85 or 89 days of no irrigation in the midst of the summer, which, to be honest, is about the length of time that you would be irrigating vines.
It's the exact time.
It is exactly, and it is in the months where you need the irrigation. It's in the driest months. And that would be a heavy blow to the wine industry in general, particularly to the gravels, because you certainly could train those vines in the gravels to grow without water, but it is not a process that happens immediately.
Well, that's what I was, again, hoping for, is that there's a nice dialogue and say, just give us some time to adjust to this, let's get our research right, and let's, make sure we're not going to starve the river and everything, but we're going to have a 10-year plan or whatever, and maybe everybody's in check. And we're all watching each other and making sure there's not irrigators left on it through the night and blah, blah, blah. And
well, everybody's got flow meters. So, the regional council will definitely pick up users. But I like your idea of sort of everybody tapering back slowly over time. And this research project we're doing, we're actually measuring the amount of water put onto both halves of the vineyard. And one of the vineyards is in very gravelly soil in the Gimlet Gravels. So we will have an idea of how much water, at a minimum, you can get by with.
Yeah.
To get our current yield that we're aiming for.
And that's what I mean. I don't even just mean on a commercial level you'd be a man in need. I think your research and what your findings are going to be immediately like, this could be a little guideline for us to keep an eye on and to play ball with, and hopefully you don't get sucked into a political tornado or anything,
But I'm hoping not as well.
Yeah.
Because I'm a scientist, so I can state the facts. I can state my opinions based on those facts. And, if I'm an expert witness or something, that's all I can do.
For the record, I could totally see you being like the scientist in a movie of a disaster or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
You've kind of got that look and feel, Mark.
Played by Jeff Goldblum in the movie, I assume.
I'm telling you, the water is coming. Why won't they listen to you?
So yeah, we'll see. This is going to be a really exciting season. Just to get an idea of how little we can get by with, and does that make the wine better, and what does that do to the economics of the vineyard? Because I really do think that, especially in Hawke's Bay, especially with red wine, you can cream it. You can make a lot of money if you're selling Marbre Sèvres, because you can crop it at twice the tonnage that you can crop red wines at, and you get right around $2,000 a ton for it. So an immensely profitable crop. But here in Hawke's Bay, you get much less for Sav, and you can't crop it the same. But we've hung our reputation on things like Chardonnay and things like red wines where you can't get that same yield. So really, your margins are much slimmer.
Yeah.
So anything you can do to reduce the costs of farming, let's just leave quality aside. Let's just say all quality being equal, anything that you can do to save a bit of cash, Oh, I don't have to do that one weed spray, because I didn't grow weeds because I irrigated differently. Or, at the very least, I didn't have to pump as much water from my bore to irrigate my vineyard because the vines didn't need it. All of that's a direct
This is what I'm really hoping for is like, I just know the way a lot of growers think, and I get it. They got families, and they're just not used. They can't just change overnight. But I think the weed spraying is just completely out of control, and I wish it would stop. But I think if a good compromise could be, aligned with your research to be like, well, maybe you only have to do one for this year, and then maybe over the next year you realize I don't have to do any, and I could figure out another way to. Maybe I only have to undervine mow like once or twice for the whole year, and everybody's better off. And because I'm not over irrigating and growing weeds like you were just saying. So I tend to be not somebody who, I'm not going to be a organic Nazi or a biodynamic Nazi, even though I really believe in that.
Yeah.
But I get it from the other standpoint, and people are scared, and you kind of have to pull them along into that way. But I see something like the project you're working on as a really good way to pull people back into an area that makes a lot more sense for a lot more reasons, and then they can all of a sudden say, oh yeah, well there's this and that as well.
Yeah.
And we don't have to do all these other things that are, wasting. I mean, the weed spray thing and what we're finding out that does to the environment and stuff. I got my kid. We're living on a vineyard here. I don't really want her around it. But on top of that, diesel, everything else you're wasting when you're riding through the vineyard millions of times. What's a vineyard manager going to do, Mark? What are they going to do with all their free time if you come along with all this? What are they going to? They're going to be leaf plucking themselves, I guess.
Well, hopefully they'll be going out with a pressure chamber and measuring their vines, so they determine when the water actually needs to be put on. The herbicide thing is an interesting point, and the judicious use of herbicides in vineyards is definitely something that will not be allowed forever. Whether it be market pressure, which is the most likely thing that will drive us away from it. There's certainly herbicide-resistant weeds that are developing, things like ryegrass down in Marlborough, and there's actually some up here in Hawke's Bay and some up in Gizzy as well. That's a problem. And there's some ryegrass that's doubly resistant to both Roundup, glyphosate, as well as Buster, glufosinate, and those are the two most common. Well, the reason it's resistant is those are the two most commonly used herbicides, and our reliance on chemistry is really tenuous because there's no new chemistry. There's no new herbicide chemistry. There hasn't been for about 40 years, and there's no new ones in the pipeline. So our existing herbicides that we have is what we have to deal with. And so anything, the whole nother research project that has nothing to do with water that we're doing is looking to get away from herbicides, to reduce their use, or look at how do we keep non-chemically weeded vineyards profitable. Try to keep yield up when you undervine cultivate or undervine mow. And that's another research project we have on the go, started last year, and we've gotten some real positive results there.
Well, you got any good customers up here in Hawke's Bay? Because I'm always looking for good growers who aren't weed spraying and they are doing some cultivation.
I believe you work for one of them.
I work for one of them. I know that. And I'm actually across the street. I'm very happy to say Zan's Viognier, as far as we last discussed, he wasn't going to weed spray this year. So I think that's a great, at least that block. I don't know about the rest of the block.
Viognier is a good variety to avoid weed spraying because it will tend to grow a huge dense canopy and it does rot pretty quickly. So a nice open canopy, lots of sun exposure.
So if you do speak to Zan, put a little reminder in there for me.
Okay, gotcha.
But I see him fairly regularly. But just say, hey, I heard you're, not weed spraying and in that block, and because I think that's great, and people should be encouraged. But so I can just, if you don't mind me just sort of checking something out there. So part of our research trial, and we did it up in Hawke's Bay and Merlot and down in Marlborough on Save, was to go with a single early season spray
and then follow it up with either mowing or cultivation or something non-chemical, something that a plant will never develop resistance to. And we didn't see a single negative effect of that. The yields were all exactly the same. The grape chemistry was all exactly the same. The fruit health was all exactly the same. If anything, the moving away from herbicides actually pushed the ripeness of the fruit a little bit.
Oh, okay.
In Marlborough, in one of our Sav vineyards. So it does look like this idea that I need to keep the undervine perfectly clean and spray herbicides 3 times a year is completely unnecessary. The competition, when the weeds compete with the vines at critical times, is early in the season. So yes, do an early season spray to get rid of that competition. But then once the fruit's there, once you've hit set and flowering, a little bit of stuff under the vines isn't a problem.
Yeah, because also, I mean, there's. I'm going to state this as a question, or question it as a statement, I should say. When you do have a bit more under the vine and stuff going on in the soil, mealybug will stay down in the soil theoretically.
There are definitely species of ground cover plants that mealybug prefers to grapevines.
And could help with that over-watering irrigation as well, or suck up some, having a little bit of grass under the vine isn't the worst thing in the world for other reasons? What are the other reasons?
Well, I'm a huge fan of undervine mowing, especially for red grapes, because firstly, you're not striving for extreme tonnage, because undervine mowing really does decrease your potential tonnage. Okay, but so in Sav, maybe that's a bad thing. For many Sav growers, it's just not a goer because I can't get less than 16 tons, so I can't undervine mow. For people up in Hawke's Bay, for people growing Pinot down in Marlborough that are striving for a fraction of that tonnage, I think undervine mowing is a great tool. It naturally competes with the vine. Again, it can compete with the vine too strongly, but that's where having something like a pressure chamber or having someone come in and measure the vines, you can determine when they need water, and you can give them a good long drink. The problem with undervine mowing, and lots of people have tried it and lots of people have gone away from it, is that people have gone to undervine mowing, but they haven't changed their irrigation practice. So they're still going with this irrigation for a short time every other day. And the way I like to think of undervine grass in particular, because grass pretty much completely colonizes the top 10 centimeters of soil, is that basically if you put on water, unless you get it down to 11 centimeters, the grass is going to take it all. Yeah. Your vines won't have access to any of it. And if you irrigate for an hour every other day, maybe that water goes down 15 centimeters. So, the grass is taking 2/3 of the water that you're putting on. Whereas if you wait and put on, 8 hours of irrigation every 2 weeks, which is the same amount of water, that water will go much deeper into the profile. And assuming you have a soil that'll hold on to that, and again, the gravels may not, but no one really knows, then the vine gets a vast majority of the water that you've put on rather than the grass. And so I think a lot of the people that have gone away from undervine mowing simply tried to change one thing in their vineyard, and it didn't work the way that they had hoped it would.
Yeah.
But if they had maybe thought things through a little bit better or been able to measure the vines, they would have been able to make that undervine mowing work. And when you do get a season like last year where you get a huge downpour, kind of near harvest, undervine grass is a great way to sort of suck some of that water out of the soil so the vine doesn't have this huge amount of water available to it. And so, I think it's a great tool. I think it's underutilized. But you need to be careful. You can't just change your sprayer to a mower and assume and keep everything else the same and assume you're going to get a good result.
I would imagine with anything in the vineyard, you'd have to look at it as a whole, and what are the other things we're doing that are going to affect that, So, well, man, we covered a lot, but I don't want to let you go before we talk about beer.
Okay, well, I don't mind talking about beer at all. I mean, it takes a lot of beer to talk about wine. I mean, that's why I had 6 before we did this thing.
So you got a little beer project going, and I've tasted the beers. They're good beers.
Thank you.
What's going on with your beers?
So, the beer project is really a collaboration between myself and my friend Damian Birchman. It's basically our money-losing business that we have.
Sure.
So, the research pays the bills, and then the beer company sort of sucks the bank account dry. But no, really, we love making beer. We love the idea of craft beer. For me personally, I dislike most craft beers because I find them far too bitter. It seems to be, and I know this is a bit of it was the same in the States, and I don't know if it just jumped the pond to here, that the way that microbrewers go about their day is, how can I make the most bitter beer out there? How can I add more hops to my beer? And, that's a very easy way to make beer. Hops are reasonably cheap, especially in New Zealand. Making bitter beer just means add them at the beginning of the boil and boil for a long time. So it doesn't require any art at all. But I don't like drinking those beers, and I particularly don't like drinking those beers with food.
Yeah.
And coming from the wine background, I want my alcoholic beverages to play well with food.
Yeah, it's over extraction, over oak, that same kind of young wine region type of thing is going on in the microbrew world. And sure, the same thing happened in Philadelphia 20 years ago when the boom really started there, maybe 25 years ago. And it's mellowed. It's funny how many more mellow stouts are out there now, and malty beers. And as you know, you remembered so kindly of you to remember that I like malty beers and balanced beers a lot more than these double hopped, giant beers that are out there, and dry hop, blah, 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 And I, for the record, I hate a pumpkin beer. I'm just not a fan.
I don't like pumpkins.
Pumpkin spice.
I don't like pumpkins full stop. So that's not a beer we're probably going to end up making.
Though there are great pumpkins in Hawke's Bay, and I eat pumpkin a lot, and I actually enjoy saying the word pumpkin.
Okay, yeah. See, I like a butternut pumpkin, which we call a squash in America.
Yeah.
But yeah, pumpkins, it's not, let's say, not my favorite vegetable. So we shan't be making any beers from that anytime soon. Maybe come harvest time, it is an appropriate thing to do.
What beers are you guys making? What are the...
So we've got our three that we started with to start the company. Miss Tiffany is a blonde ale. All of them pretty heavy on the malt. Miss Tiffany doesn't have a lot of roasted malt, so it's sort of a light golden in color. But lots of aroma hops. So real pretty, real citrusy, real floral. Good summertime beer, easy drinking. We've got the Cherokee Indian Pale Ale, which is quite a malty little number. Stylistically, it's probably closer to an English Pale Ale. And then that one's going quite well in pubs around town. And then we have our Boobalicious Red Ale, which is our hoppy beer. 120 IBUs, twice what the human perception of bitterness threshold is. So bloody bitter, but a good malt hit as well.
Yep.
And then that one's been pretty popular in the microbrew scene. We've got a couple of prototypes that we're quite happy with and about ready to get labels for and release. One is called the Atramentus Black IPA. So a dark beer, but dry hop like an IPA.
Oh, okay.
So it got the maltiness of a dark beer, but that sort of real fresh, grassy, floral hop character. And then finally the Umami Brown Ale, which is a brown ale, and at the very end of the boil, a bit of miso is added.
And that's your favorite?
Tiny. It's my baby. It's the one that I've been developing, and is particularly aimed at the high end dining market.
Yeah.
And it's not so much miso that you taste miso, but it does have an ever so slight saltiness, and it does have an ever so slight savoriness at the end. And it's a real big malty number. Again, not outrageously bitter, so that it plays well with food.
Cool, man.
Yeah, so the beauty of the brewing is you can always sort of do one-off brews and play with things. And we got a new grain, we got a new hop. Let's make a little bit of beer.
That is the one thing that I am envious. I wouldn't say jealous, because I wouldn't want to be a brewer. I kind of feel like
you have the beard for it.
I do.
Yeah, you need to grow it out more.
I need to grow it out more. It's more of a constant grind, and there's always a mash going, and there's but if something goes wrong, you just make another one.
Yes, and you don't have vintage where you're working 18-hour days.
Yeah, but we have these real peaks and valleys in the wine industry, and but I think that suits me more. I tend to happy to go a little crazy certain times a year, and then have my time off. Or brewers just seem to be, like I said, it's more of a constant grind, and they have to be way more cleaner than we do.
Super clean. Yeah, wine You can stomp wine by feet or with
Yeah.
your feet, and it'll still be delicious. You definitely can't do that with beer. The pH is wrong. You can't use sulfur. And lots
need
of
to get
people
the-
love sour beers. I am not one of those people.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan. I mean, I've had there was one group of sour beers I had in South Carolina at a brewery called Birds Fly South. I went to a beer dinner on Valentine's Day with a
How
buddy
romantic.
of mine because we were traveling through doing some wine sales, and those were, if you ever get a chance, it's one of the hottest breweries in the South in the States. Again, Birds Fly South, and they real understated. I mean, they had like a mango chili beer or something that I was like, okay, what's this going to be? You know, I'm going to be, and I wanted a second one, you know, which never happens with those kind of crazy. And everything he did was barrel aged, and it was treated like wine, so it was very understated and nice and soft and everything. But besides that, sour beers, you know, it's like, to me, that's a wine fault. So
Yeah, I totally. I mean, you use plenty of lactic acid bacteria making wine, and we will eventually do something barrel aged, but it'll be a big black beer more than likely, and we will ozone the hell out of those barrels,
Yeah.
sanitize the hell out of those barrels so that there's no Brett and no
steam,
no
man.
lactic acid. Steam is probably
Steam
what
is
we'll use.
probably-
That's what Damos got at Elephant Hill. So.
Oh, lucky him.
Yeah.
All right, man. Well, I'm going to let you go. We just knocked out 55 minutes or so, so that
Nice.
was quick.
Nice.
And I'll let you get on to your research, and thanks for doing it, man.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dan. It's always a pleasure.
Cheers. Oh, how about Kras? Smart guy, interesting guy. Really good to sit down with him and catch up with him. I was able to catch up with him again over the weekend. And like I said, very great to have him back in Hawke's Bay and doing some really, really important work here. Again, it's Crazy Bay Beers. I don't know the website offhand, but I guarantee Mr. Google will be able to help you out with that. But you'll find it at some local beers pubs now around Hawke's Bay. And I'm sure they have a website you can go on and try to get some from them. But and a couple wine. I think it's in New World in Napier as well, so you can check that out. Decibelwines.com, guys. We've got the wine club up there, and of course the store. We're shipping to Australia, doing a wine club there. We're just getting that started, so stay tuned for that. I will be in Sydney soon, and down in Wellington, Martinborough, and Christchurch coming up. So I'm going to be talking to some winemakers and folks in those areas. I think it would be great to try to catch up with some exciting winemakers. So stay tuned for some people from Martinborough. Don't want to give it away too soon, but I think there might be one revisited from a previous podcast and somebody new. Try to get some women on this podcast, which I've got 2 coming up. So stay tuned, guys. Thanks a lot, and cheers.